Hello. All right. This is Mr. Lawyer. This is Siddhartha. I'm going to do and we will do Govinda. So I'm going to finish the book with this lecture. We're going to talk about happiness in others, introspection, respect, all is one, suffering is joy, battling with fate. We'll talk about knowledge versus wisdom, and then we'll talk about kind of the overall message of this book. And what it means. So let's get cracking. All right, the chapter. This is after his son leaves, and for a long time, right? He's sad about it. So many thousands enjoy this sort of precious happiness. Why can't I? So he still kind of goes back to this envying, suffering, or happiness rather in others. And notice that again, there are these long kind of introspective paragraphs, and that gets us back to this point of like, this is a very introspective protagonist, right? However, he begins to respect the ordinary lives of others, or the ridiculous habits were losing their ridiculous form. They're becoming comprehensible, lovable, even worthy of respect. A mother's blind love for her child, a self-satisfied father's blind pride of his one little son, a vain young woman's blind, furious urge to bedeck herself with jewels and attract men's admiring glances. All these drives, all these childish matters, were no longer mere child's play. He was able to love them for this. He saw life. They're living the indestructible, the Brahman, in each of their passions, each of their deeds. So he begins to see life and Brahman and God in others and in ordinary things. He kind of reaches this point, living on down by the river. I shot my baby. That the river is made of himself and those he loved, and it rang out that all the voices are ringing at the same time, right? Sorrowfully, searchingly, but others' voices joined it, voices of joy and sorrow, good and wicked, voices laughing and mourning, 100 voices, 1,000. Which brings us to, well, he kind of gets into it with his discussion with Govinda, in which he says, like, in the center, like, Buddha is already present, like God's already present. So it's an interesting point to reach where you're like, everything is like in this moment, and that's kind of the only thing that's real. I think there's an interesting point. For me, it's on page 114. This is right near the end of this chapter. So Vasudeva and Siddhartha are talking, and Vasudeva's like, do you hear it? Right? And they're listening to the voice of Om, perfection, right? The holy word. The greatest song of 1,000 voices consisted of only a single word, Om, perfection. Right? In this hour, Siddhartha ceased to battle with fate, ceased to suffer. Battling with fate. This brings us to two ideas, and then we're going to tie it back to Om. Right? This battle. Not everyone battles in life, I think. That's a kind of specific way to live, but for some, it's a struggle, it's difficult. Siddhartha's a highly intelligent person. He's also very, emotional. Like highly sensitive and also spiritual. When you have those combination of traits, you're going to suffer in life. So you also have fate. Nietzsche has a quote which says, "Love thy fate, love your fate." Fate isn't like everything is going to happen. Like look at a tarot card. It's more like if you are born as this kind of person, like love that is the kind of person that you are. And so maybe Siddhartha is reaching that point. Remember too that Hesse was big into Nietzsche, and he was also kind of into all this Eastern philosophy, which we're really getting into in the end of this book, and a couple other things. Also notice too that the word that is sacred from the river is the divine word, is Om, and it kind of goes back to, right? He was a Brahmin son, he ran away from all that, he ran away from religion, and now in the end of his life he's returning to it, right? So it's interesting, he kind of comes full circle when it comes to divinity and life, and seeing the two as connected. So, interesting, eh? Vasudeva goes off, out to the pasture, Govinda comes for the last chapter, and this is when, Siddhartha and him have one last philosophical conversation. Interestingly enough, Govinda doesn't recognize him once again. They go back and forth, right? And it's interesting too that Siddhartha kind of toward the end denies that he had teachers or doctrines, but he plays it both ways. He says, I turned my back on them, Right? Nonetheless, I've had many teachers since then. A beautiful courtesan was my teacher for a long time. A wealthy merchant was my teacher, and a few dice players. Even an ignorant disciple of Buddha, was my teacher, right? Most of all, however, I learned here from the river, from my predecessor, Vasudeva. Right? He also forgets to kind of mention, like, from himself. He's always looking, he's always searching, he's always asking questions as he goes about his life. Finally, we'll look at where he says, one can pass on knowledge but not wisdom. One can pass on knowledge but not wisdom. One can find wisdom, one can live it, one can be supported by it, one can work wonders with it, one cannot speak or touch it. I sometimes suspected this even as a youth and what drove it from my teachers. Right? Maybe as a youth you have to kind of outlive your ridiculous mistakes growing up to get there and to achieve it. Knowledge is facts, wisdom is something else. It's the poetry of life. All right, so what is this book about? And why did Hermann Hesse write it? What's the ultimate message? Keep in mind, too, it kind of ends on that, by the way, like, Govinda kisses his forehead and sees all these things, and, Siddhartha's like, now it's my time to go, right? So everything kind of comes back, and you have a very Hessian male kiss. What is the point of this book? Hesse was somebody who could describe poetically peace, life, calmness, without ever actually really achieving it himself. He was a very tortured soul as an individual, kind of struggled with, countless psychological problems, failed marriages, etc. So he's very able to tie together like Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy on paper. As a person, he never could quite do it. So what is the moral lesson of this story? Is it retreat to nature? Is it find balance? It's an odd kind of moral story because he didn't really live a perfect life. He, one could say, neglected his son. He never did go back to his father or his family. Never, right? He kind of gave up on that. He probably could have treated his love better. So it's not a perfect story, but for certain types of people, and when you discuss in Siddhartha that some of you will suffer more, and you see people light up, and you're like, wait, what? And when you realize that the sensitive soul, the poet's soul, as Hesse calls him in other books, like that life is, while more beautiful, it's also more difficult. You see the poetry of life, you will feel its pain. So certain people struggle, and maybe Hesse is an author for those kind of people. And certain phases of life are more a struggle, certain chapters, than others. So this is a different kind of voice, I think, a different kind of moral story. It's kind of like a quiet whisper. So if this is the first time you've read Siddhartha and experienced it, and you feel any inkling of like, that's interesting, that kind of resonates, I would encourage you to go back to it. This is the kind of book that you should, reread every couple of years. It's a quick read. So, pick it up sometime, see the kind of messages that jump out, see what you notice about Siddhartha. The first time I read it, I was like enthralled. Like, this is the greatest guy ever. As I reread it more and more, as I teach it, I kind of see that this is a little bit more complex than I realized. There's always more stuff that I'm picking up from it. So hopefully that would, that might be the same for you. Anyway, I'm respectfully signing off. Okay, send your questions, your comments, etc. It's pretty cool to get emails and stuff from people from Portugal reading this. So yeah, Andale pues, life is good, life is beautiful, and thank you, Grandpa, for introducing me to Hermann Hesse. All right, adios.